Welcome to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock from MCG Quantity Surveyors. And today we have a very special guest back on the podcast. We have mattknight from Precium. He's a buyer's agent based in the Illawarra, Southern Highlands, sort of south coast of New South Wales area. And that is a part of the country that has topped the charts in terms of capital growth in years gone by. And we have a chat to him about where the opportunities are for investors, what price points you can get in there. Is it a location for first-time investors, or is it for people that have a few more runs on the board? We also chat about the emerging trend of baby boomers downsizing. They represent nearly a quarter of the Australian population, and they are actively looking for locations like where Matt is based for properties that suit their needs. And we discuss how you can take advantage of that emerging trend. We also talk about development opportunities. Matt even asked me some questions about scrapping for developers. So if that's something that's on your mind, we cover that off as well. But it's a real whirlwind tour of that part of the world, and Matt's insights on where the opportunities are very valuable for anyone looking in that part of the country. Here's Matt. Mattknight, thanks for joining me back on Geared for Growth.
Good morning, Mike.
It's been a little while between drinks, but I presume that your little slice of heaven has still been humming along and doing all sorts of things. Can you catch us up to date? Because for people that didn't listen to your first episode, which they definitely should, you're based in sort of the Illawarra, Southern Highlands part of the world, the New South Wales south coast. And that saw quite a lot of action during the pandemic with Sydney-siders that were cashed up, that wanted a space where they didn't feel like they were going to get infected, and for some reason swinging cats is a national pastime, so they needed space for that. I'm interested to see what's happening in that part of the world, this far post-COVID, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a good jumping off point. And it is it's a tough cross to bear living, a couple of hours outside of Sydney and not having to commute with the masses and needing to jump in the ocean to justify my existence down here every second day. So, the sea change lifestyle is a pretty sweet gig. I'm very thankful to be down here. And my wife and I actually left Sydney 15 years ago. So I think it took about 6 years before I started getting complacent about that. But we still have every couple of days, we still pinch ourselves and go, gee, it is actually a pretty good place to live, isn't it? We saw a really, it was a well documented and publicized boom during COVID, and that well and truly did end, as all things must. And I think the rate hiking cycle that we then went through after that period dampened probably the second home or the beach house dream for a lot of people for a couple of years. Yep. So I think we saw a big market shift towards priority changing, overseas travel coming back in, prioritizing other things in the family finances. And so whilst for a few years, a relocation, a kind of a work from home movement and a second home movement all converged into a perfect storm, that definitely took probably 18 months, 24 months to kind of wash out. And we did see, look, after 60 to 90% capital growth in a 2 to 3 year period, probably a 3 year period through COVID, we saw a 20 to 25% price pullback off the very peak of that in that wash up of post-COVID changing priorities and rising interest rates. And we saw those pullbacks really bottom out early this year. So I think there was a double bottom in the Illawarra where there was Feb 23 and Feb 24 saw kind of a dead cat bounce of kind of low activity with some then optimism crept back in and then it came out again. And I would say the Illawarra is now well off the bottom and growing again, even though we've got very patchy dynamics. So different price points, different suburbs and different locations with proximity to beach are not behaving in the same way. Further down the coast, it's still very quiet. So there was an article about the Eurobodalla, which is the Batemans Bay market south of me. That's still not recovering. It's pretty quiet down there. if you're thinking about macro cycles, probably the far south coast is starting to look like it's really good value.
Yep.
But most people want to be buying in a slightly more active market that's already shown some green shoots of recovery. We've definitely
Yes.
got that in the Illawarra and the Shoalhaven. I think the far south coast lags by 6 to 12 to 18 months in many cases. So we're still seeing that recovery creep back in.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting, because I wanted to pick apart two things that you discussed there. Firstly, I'm interested in investor fundamentals in that part of the world, because I suppose we do kind of get more of a vision of these, $1, $2, $5 million properties that cashed up Sydney side as are coming and snapping up. But there are some investor pockets, and when you were sort of talking about the markets behaving differently, it sort of made me think about median prices. And you can look at median prices for a lot of the areas where you are, but the segmentation is so broad, because you
Yep.
do have multi-million dollar properties and I think tens of millions of dollars of properties, right? But there are still properties around the sort of $700,000 to
Yes.
$800,000 mark as well. So how do we help us to understand that part of the world?
I wish I could help you to understand that. Sometimes I don't understand that, but
Right.
it is fascinating. I guess the probably the simplest way to come at that is to think about the Illawarra first. The Illawarra is a fascinating piece of geography because we have an ocean on one side, we have a very dramatic cliff escarpment on the other side, and we have this narrow strip of real estate, where all the humans live. And within 2 or 3 streets, you can go from a beachfront house that might be worth $5 or $6 million, and then you can be in, three or four streets back, less than 1.2 kilometers away. You could be in a street with a couple of old fibros, a little bit of public housing scattered around, and a home for $800,000 on a 600
Wow.
square meter block. So we've got this vast differential between pockets even within suburbs, and the suburb medians in the Illawarra do vary a lot. The northern suburbs being much more expensive by and large compared to the southern. So in terms of investor activity, you asked about that. I would say the majority of our investors are probably priced between 700 and 1.2 million, and they are almost all looking for capital growth because they're not really finding great positive cash flow deals in the Illawarra. Even when we target multi-income or small blocks of flats, the yields just aren't spectacular. 4% would be an incredible outcome in many cases.
Right.
So we're often in threes and fours. Very rarely do we get much above 5, for example.
That sort of seems to be a function of price point, even from a national perspective. If you're buying something 5 or 600,000, it seems much easier to get a 4 or 5% yield than once you start going above 700. Would you say?
I would, and it's just not common to be able to generate $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a week in rent from a property. So that whilst there's great homes that will rent for $1,500 a week in the Illawarra, they're probably on a 2.5% yield. Those properties. So I think we're seeing Wollongong probably mimic Sydney in many ways because of its proximity and that constrained supply. We've just seen growth over the years that has driven the yields down. And the pent-up demand that constantly comes out of Sydney from people who would like to move to somewhere that's as affordable as Western Sydney but has the beach, or that's a different lifestyle because instead of being in the inner west or the eastern suburbs in an apartment, they can have a backyard to raise kids. That sort of aspiration has continued to put a floor under prices.
And I think it will forever, right? And it's a similar sort of thing when you go the other direction, north of Sydney to the Central Coast. Whatever's sort of happening in those markets sort of seems to be an outcome of what's happening in Sydney.
Yep.
What sort of saving would you have for making a move from Sydney to your area? Like, are we talking it's a 30% price differential, or how would you classify it?
Yeah, I guess it would depend on which part of Sydney and what kind of real estate you're selling to leave.
Of course.
In terms of the median prices in the southern extreme edge of Sydney, where our biggest rail and road corridor is the Sutherland Shire, which is actually where I grew up.
Yep.
And you're talking about family homes in the Shire starting at about mid ones for something very basic, and going up into the 2s and 3s commonly for a decent sized family home. So I'd say high ones would get you something livable as a family home in the Shire, and then anything with proximity to water or anything fancy or big is going to be over 2 million.
Yep.
To then trade down to the northern suburbs of the Illawarra, because that's such a narrow strip of land with such quality beaches, you actually don't get much of a saving at all. But as you head to central Wollongong, so your fig trees, your Kiravilles, and your Mangatons, that's close to Wollongong CBD, but west of the CBD, so not right on the beach. I think you are getting something like a 20 to 30% saving there, and you can pick up homes for around about 1.2, 1.3 million.
Yep.
And they're good homes in that sort of 1.2 to 1.4 is a good price point for those suburbs. And then if you come another 15 minutes south, where in the lake suburbs, we call them, which is south of Wollongong CBD and south of the old steelworks, which used to be a very big social divide. But we've got a string of suburbs they're older. There's a lot of old red bricks and fibro 3-bed, 1-bath housing stock that was built for the BHP workers in the 60s. And they're on nice big blocks, 600, 700, 800 square metre blocks. Yep. And they are gentrifying like crazy because they're getting both the young family that is coming out with, say, an 800, 900K budget as a first home buyer. They're getting baby boomers downsizing, looking for affordability, where they want to say blended families looking for a house and granny flat on a nice big sprawling block. Mm-hmm. They're getting developers attacking them to try and knock down the homes and build duplexes and triplexes when they're closer to the water. And a lot of these lake suburbs have a little bit of slope and they can catch a water view. So I think we're seeing a really well-established but slow-moving gentrification process down there. And you can still pick up homes sub $1 million in those suburbs. And we've really targeted them for our investor base.
Yeah, I do want to unpack the influence of the baby boomers, but for investors that might be sort of looking to that area, I mean, starting from 700 up, I mean, it might not necessarily be a first investment property for someone that really wants to have, maybe a lower price point, a more attractive yield, because that can be a challenge as the first investor, making sure that you're able to service that. So typically, how would you categorize the investors that are active in your space? Are they slightly more further along in their journey or sophisticated, or is there something that they're zeroing in on that they see as part of their strategy? The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
Yeah, good question. I would say it's a mixed bag of first-time investors and the investor who's already got 2 or 3 places and they're looking for a very unique asset to kind of round out their portfolio. The first-time investors either have an affinity for Wollongong because of family reasons. Maybe they've got relatives who live there, or they've had an extra cash injection so they can afford a slightly more expensive property as their first investment. So they may have had a couple $100,000 in inheritance money come in, or they may have parents giving them a hand. Or they've got a job that allows them to be borrowing a bit more. Quite a few of our clients are in the medical profession, for example. Where you've got a young couple who are doing doctor work or medical work, young surgeons, etc. Their borrowing capacity is just a little bit higher, even when they're just a couple of years out, because the banks love to throw money at them. So we're definitely seeing that investor base coming from all the demographics in terms of people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. Mm-hmm. But I would say there's usually a reason personally as to why they can afford to go from a first-time investment that, many of us started with might have only been a more affordable first investment. My first place was 65 grand. So,
Yeah,
that was
it's
a long
different.
time ago.
Yeah.
I'm 93 years old, so
Well, you look great.
yeah. The skin cream's helping.
Yeah.
But so I think, definitely the sophisticated investors who are coming, which is if I look at the last 6 months, the investors that have come across my desk by volume have all been those slightly more sophisticated investors, already have a portfolio of, say, 4 properties, looking for an asset to round out the portfolio. And for me personally, because we have a reputation of buying ugly ducklings on development sites for the last decade, we've been doing that.
Yep.
The people who come by referral typically they ring up to ask, can you find me an old house that I can rent for 2 years and then knock it down and build 3 units? That's a very common brief that comes across our desk, and we've done 5 or 6 of those in the last few months.
Right.
So
And the planning controls are sort of open to that. That there's not too many headwinds.
there's definitely headwinds. Councils aren't super easy to work with, but we do have a pretty strong track record of seeing how to get through Wollongong, Shellharbour and Kiama Council's planning rules. And of the 3, I would say probably Shellharbour is the least painful to work with.
Right.
But
Okay.
Wollongong, as long as you target the right sites, and this is where it gets really interesting, because on a map you might look at sites and think that's a great development site, but in 90% of cases it won't be, because either we can't get the stormwater out, or the frontage isn't wide enough, or there's a quirk with the zoning, or there's an endangered tree that the council is not going to let you take out. So we are pretty picky with regards to sites and development, and eliminating all of the lemons. And when I say lemons, they're not bad houses, but they're certainly difficult development sites. Eliminating lemons is what we spend a lot of time doing, and trying to really hone in on the best sites that have a much higher chance of being developable.
Yeah, interesting. Well, that's a good insight into the type of person that is active in that market. So as you say, there are sort of first-time investors, but they normally would have a little bit of a backing. But the people that are quite active they've been in the game for a little while, and looking for that development upside, I suppose.
I think after COVID, there was 2 years where those development type savvy investors really went quiet, and while interest rates were rising, they were pretty nervous about buying anything. I think they're finally coming out of the woodwork, and they probably have been bored for too long. So that the kind of personality type that doesn't like leaving money in the bank.
Yeah. And we're actually at the lowest pace of construction cost growth in 22 years, believe it or not.
I do,
It's just,
actually.
it's by virtue of the fact that we had this massive jump and it hasn't gone backwards. So it's not growing at the same pace because it can't. So
And I think
materials are actually...
the average punter's assumption about the building industry at the moment is that building is nearly impossible, it's incredibly expensive, and it's going to take me years and years. So I think people are starting from a perspective that building is hard at the moment.
Yeah, and certainly in some pockets it is, and there is a very pronounced shortage of construction labour. A lot of the construction labour has gone to insurance rectification works, which takes them out of the general trades pool, and of course the huge pipeline of government infrastructure projects. So, the government's sort of saying we want to build 1.2 million homes, but they're like, we also need Badgerys Creek Airport, and we need an inland rail, and we need, high-speed rail from Brisbane to, Sunshine Coast.
They're the same people that would build all those things. And they're not having enough kids to replicate themselves. We're not seeing families of 10 brickies coming up anytime soon, are we?
No, we're not. Now,
before we move on, I want to ask you a question, because the common question that these clients give me when we're in our acquisition phase is, how do I handle depreciation on this old 1975 red brick house that may have had some renovations and may not have? So there's some depreciation, but limited. How do I handle scrapping? And where does the where does the demolishment cost, scrapping and depreciation sit with a future long-term redevelopment? And that kind of the depreciation question, but for this kind of a slow-moving property development site.
Yeah. Well, I wrote an article a couple of years ago that was sort of entitled The Death of Scrapping, because scrapping did, in many respects, die in 2017. So when you think about scrapping, I mean, the ATO calls it an asset that reaches its functional obsolescence. Aren't they great wordsmiths? So when we're talking about scrapping, it's like
My children tell me I've reached my functional obsolescence.
Yeah, I feel like I have as well most days. I have to make noises when I get up and down. That's a good indication. But what we're talking about is assets that get thrown in the bin, but have a book value or a residual value or an on-paper value. So there's two sort of main categories of depreciation. There's the building structure and there's the plant and equipment. Now, typically people only really focused on the scrapping on plant and equipment, because if you're scrapping Division 43 capital works, then that can impact your cost base, right? So if you claim that Division 43 deduction as an immediate thing, then that will reduce your cost base. So if you buy a property and you make $1 million profit, you've got to add that sort of to the profit. So not that many people were active in that space. They were looking mostly in the plant and equipment items. Now, with the changes on the 9th of May 2017, you can only scrap an asset that you've either purchased in a brand new property or you've actually installed that asset yourself. So if you think about, you buy an old property and you put carpet in there, I mean, it has an 8-year effective life, and if you decide, well, it's kind of worn out, I need to replace it 4 years down the track, then you'll kind of have, it doesn't work exactly like this, but you'll have sort of half of its value available to you as an immediate deduction. But most things last longer than the ATO effective life. So like carpet is 8 years. I don't know really many people that would be replacing the carpet that soon. And the other thing is that if they buy this property that's had a renovation and the previous owner put the carpet in, you can't claim that. You actually have to be the owner of the asset when it's that asset has never been used before. You're the first person to use it. So in that situation, the good old days of scrapping are really sort of gone. The only avenues that you have for scrapping, if it's had some improvements, or let's just say it was built prior to 1987, and most people don't kind of demolish places like that, you just need to look at the building works, but then you do have to speak to your accountant to say, well, this will impact my cost base. So if I scrap, let's say, $10,000 worth of Division 43 or structural improvements, then I need to add that to my cost base. If I have a 50% CGT exemption, let's call it $5,000, and then it's based on your marginal rate, which could be 35% of that. So you might be claiming $10,000, but then having to sort of repay $2,200 or whatever it might be. So for people that are wanting to do those small scale developments, like scrapping is not really part of the strategy anymore. There might be some bonuses to it, but it's I wish I had better news, but it's just not that much of a thing anymore.
No, it's not. And we've been explaining that to people for some time, but I think there's still a perception out there in the mindset that if I buy raw land and develop it, it's a blank canvas. But if I buy a house and develop it, I'm going to get some kind of a windfall from the demolish process. So I'm not sure how educated the public is on that particular point.
Not very, I'm going to guess. And I often get property commentators asking me to, talk about all those scrapping benefits. And I'm sort of like, sorry. It's just, you're not going to enjoy this.
That's right.
The trouble is as well, to be able to scrap an asset, the ATO goes so far as to say you can't just buy something and chuck everything in the bin and claim the residual value. You have to purchase the property with the intention of renting it out as is. Now, how do you prove an intention? Well, I suppose you do the thing and then the intention becomes truth. But you could sort of say, all right, well, I've bought this property. I've tried to rent it out. It's been on the market 3 or 4 months. It's not overpriced. So I'm going to chuck this stuff in the bin and I'm going to replace it because I'm just having trouble getting a tenant. I would say the ATO would be happy with something like that. But you can't just buy an old property, chuck everything in the bin and claim the scrapping. The ATO are pretty clear on that. People do it, I can assure you. But if the ATO were to be across that, you might have a big please explain.
Another live one that came up the other week when we were having one of these site analysis conversations with a client was around an asbestos roof.
Oh,
So,
yes.
client considering buying a house with an asbestos roof that may be good enough to retain and renovate, and then developing a couple of blocks off the back.
Yep.
And we were just having some discussions about the specific tax treatment of asbestos roofs. Are you hearing that come up much around, like
Not
if you were
that
to replace it
often.
with a tin roof?
Not that often. I mean, there's no real depreciation benefit in an original asbestos roof, because presumably it's going to have been installed prior to 1987, which is the cutoff date for depreciation claims on the original building structure. It's funny about asbestos. I mean, that was a wonder building material, just like the insulation, the fire retarding properties. It was just absolutely a groundbreaking thing. I suppose a bit like stone bench tops, we've come to realise that they're actually a
There's some
silent,
problems.
deadly thing. And I mean, asbestos is fine if it's left alone, but it does
Yeah.
sort of make people nervous, right? You just can't be messing about with it.
Yeah, that's right. And the days of drilling it and chopping it like I did when I was a kid are probably long gone. but,
Yeah.
but if
I
you
heard
leave it alone on a wall, it's pretty inert. And if it's been painted for the last few decades, it's probably unlikely to cause problems. I think the direct tax, it's not depreciable, but the direct tax saving from getting rid of an asbestos roof is the thing that this particular client was looking into.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, interesting one.
Yeah, not 100% familiar whether there might be some rebates for that sort of stuff. And that stuff does sort of come and go. Like, there were rebates for replacing your electric hot water system with gas and those sorts of things. So definitely worth looking into and having a chat to your accountant. Now, I'm going to start this next bit and I'm going to sound very professional. Here we go. According to RMIT University, in Australia, there are 5.6 million baby boomers, commanding a substantial 21.5% slice of the national population. Now, why did I read that out like some sort of B-grade newsreader? Well, because I think you're in a part of the world that is kind of like a baby boomer downsizing ground zero. And I'm interested in your thoughts about this transition of this huge subset of the population that is looking for quality accommodation, perhaps moving out of some of these blue chip areas in Sydney's with a bit of cash to spare to purchase a property that maybe is a bit better suited to their needs, getting rid of any mortgages that they might have, or giving themselves a bit of a cash injection. I want to know how that's playing out in your space, and any insights you might have for investors across the country looking to take advantage of that.
Yeah. Well, first thing is, mate, you're an A-grade newsreader, so
Thank you.
don't sell yourself short there. And yes, you're right. There are a lot of baby boomers on the South Coast, and there are a lot of baby boomers still in Sydney who I talk to who are telling me they want to move to the South Coast. So absolutely, we are ground zero for, and there's a few ground zeros, right? We're not the only location, but we're one of them. And I think the trends that I'm hearing are really that there is a desire to downsize out of the oversized, high-priced Sydney home. That's a given, and particularly where that home is worth, say, 2 to 4 million, but it's still the net worth of the family is small enough that it still forms a very big part of the family wealth. So when you've got a family that are asset rich and cash poor, the family home and the downsizing piece becomes a very big part of the financial planning for end stage of life and for legacy and wills and estates and helping the kids out and all that sort of stuff. What are they asking for? They want the world. They want to downsize, but not much. So I would say the idea of leaving a 4-3 or a 5-2 home on an 800-meter block in Sydney and buying a 2-bed, 1-bath villa is absolutely not what most of them want. Not what they're telling me. If they want a unit, it's the Sydney apartment, and then they want a bigger house on the South Coast.
Right.
And the house on the South Coast is typically a 422 on a level block, so they want to avoid stairs.
Yep.
And they want to have a fairly minimal yard. So it doesn't have to be a huge block. But a 422 is not a small house, right, for a couple.
No.
But the idea that the grandkids are going to visit, we want to have them there for Christmas, that's still a very big part of the psyche. Mm-hmm. A 322 villa is an excellent choice, and many, if they're well designed, I think they're really popular for this boomer retiring relocator. The query or the caution for the investor developer who's trying to cater to that market is, don't build it too small. Right. If you go too cramped and there's no courtyard and there's no outlook from any of the windows, the boomers just aren't interested. That they really want amenity, and right. it's not a place to sleep so they can commute back to the city for work. They have to feel good about what they're buying, and they have to feel good about where they're going to be reading the newspaper and where they're going to be sipping their coffee. So we need
perhaps courtyard. To the end of their days, right?
Well, the goal, and there was an article in was it The Age or The Australian? I forget which, but just last week about end stage housing and the cost changes that the government's brought in around nursing homes and contributions, and aging in place is a huge part of the policy piece, and they're going to keep tweaking the costs of how people pay for their non-clinical care. But and that's a whole nother conversation. But I think, yes, there are lots of people whose goal is to avoid retirement villages and nursing homes for as long as they possibly can. So aging in place is a very real goal, and boomers didn't want to talk about that 5 years ago, but they're finally starting to be willing to talk about that. They're ringing me saying, when we buy this next place, it'll be our last place, so we have to get this right. And that language is creeping in, and I find as they approach the magic 70, they're much more willing to use language like that, which is confronting, right? None of us want to talk about end of life.
Not really, no. But I mean, it's one of those things you've got to plan for. And I've inspected a number of nursing homes, and only one of them did I think was nice. Only one. That was in Neutral Bay, and bloody expensive, I'm assuming. I've seen some horrible things, and I think a lot of people will try and avoid that if they can. Are these people purchasing at a price point that is probably a little bit higher than the average investor? And if so, what can an investor do in and around the periphery of, say, baby boomers looking to a certain location? Do you think they can ride the wave of this kind of demographic repositioning?
I think they can through a couple of methods. So a friend and I actually just did a JV project where we did a 1-into-2 subdivision, and we did a renovation on the original 3-bedroom house, which was on one level. And we did that with every intention of making it a boomer-friendly property. And the person who bought it was a lady in her 60s. So you can buy a 3-bed, 1-bath, very basic house that may need some cosmetic renovations. And if your midterm goal is for that property to resell or to be appropriate for a baby boomer, either as a rental or as a resale project, would be to renovate it really appropriately for that demographic, to potentially eliminate too many narrow doorways or stairs, to make sure that it doesn't necessarily have to be wheelchair accessible, but to just keep an eye on accessibility as far as the house goes. And it might be a tweak of where the driveway runs and how you park the car and how you get into the house from the car, for example.
Yep.
There are so many homes in the Illawarra that have some slope in them, and that have a goat track of a driveway to a freestanding garage. Then you have to walk back down a slippery slope and then up 5 stairs to get to the house. Well, why can't that be fixed and those stairs minimized and that pathway be made safer? Even if the house is still in its original state, that's going to make a material difference to an older resident.
That's an interesting one. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities in that space. Before we wrap up, what else do property investors need to know about the Wollongong South Coast area that is your backyard, if people are wanting to perhaps inquire into that particular market that has seen some pretty spectacular growth in certain parts of the last few years? Well, maybe last 5 years.
Yeah, I think it has seen some spectacular growth. It's definitely seen a fall back to reality. I think the take home message is if you're waiting for prices to halve again, it's probably not going to happen. I can't see any magic increase in supply or any disappearance of demand. So I think we've probably found a relative bottom to the market, and value is starting to look much better than it did even a year ago. And you know, we negotiated a property for a client last night that was in Thurrool, in a northern Illawarra suburb, quite an expensive property, but that property probably would have been about $800,000 more at the top of COVID. So, we definitely think we've found the natural bottom of what the market is for now, assuming all things being equal, assuming interest rates and economic kind of things moving forward, not if we don't get hit by an asteroid, things will change. But what else to know? Look, positive cash flow is tricky to find. So don't come in expecting an 8% yield off the bat. That's pretty rough. If you're, even looking at house and granny flat pairs, duplex pairs, small blocks of flats, we're probably in that 3.5 to 5.5% yield band. So being realistic about cash flow. But look, proximity to beach and proximity to the train lines and the major corridors for transport have always been very good safety factors and very good drivers of both growth and risk mitigators. So I would say stick to the fundamentals and chase blue chip assets.
Beautiful. Great advice. And thank you for sharing all of those insights today, Matt. We always appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Cheers.